Can't say it now. Editor, come out. Treleaven. On the show today, David Treleaven. Boom. On the show today, David Treleaven. So I've read David's book on Trauma-Sensitive Mindfulness, and I think it is a great book. It is much needed. I know he works with embodiment. I know he works with mindfulness, of course, teaches with some friends of mine. Yeah, I think this topic is fascinating and people need to hear it. So David, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me. We have a lot of overlapping, both colleagues, but also things that we're interested in. So I'm happy to be talking about it.
How did you get interested in the body and mindfulness, David? What was the beginning of your journey?
Yeah, well, I'm from Canada. I've just always been interested in transformative work. It's like whatever works, whatever is going to really work. And embodiment to me is the most practical methodology that we can actually be using. It just really works. So I was someone who meditated for a long time. I ended up having some kind of challenging experiences in my practice. And long story short, it led me to study this intersection around mindfulness and trauma. A couple people said, "Hey, have you thought about this?" So I got really curious. I studied it. And my experience around a lot of trauma work, just because you change the way you're thinking about it, doesn't mean that you're actually changing how you're experiencing your body in the world. So the body, mindfulness, trauma, that intersection is something I've been really interested in. And really it's about best practices. Like what's anyone who's asking people to pay attention to their body in the present moment, what should we know about trauma if we're going to be doing that?
Great. And we're right in there, I think, on the crux of this, that years ago, up till fairly recently, people were teaching mindfulness. They were saying, okay, sit down, sit still, focus on your breath, don't move, 10-day Vipassana retreat. Everyone's going to be fine with that, right? That's not going to cause any problems.
Right.
That was the attitude.
Right. Well, that's where maybe 15 years ago when this all started, that was the person who I was trying to reach. And the kind of the life commitment that I had was, I don't want someone who's struggling with, dysregulation of their nervous system, or who in a 10-day retreat that wouldn't necessarily work for them. I wanted that there to be some modifications for that person. So it's not just sit still, stay in practice, take it back to the cushion. So I wanted there to be some options, but I want to be clear. I'm not saying that meditation and mindfulness should be comfortable. It's actually still about holding a container for people. It's not like trying to just walk on eggshells here. So that seems like also a really important balance.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what would you say, like just one-on-one for someone who's like, hey, I'm a meditation teacher. It seems to help people. I love it, but I don't really know anything about trauma. Like, why should I learn about trauma? I've been trained in a Buddhist lineage, or I've been trained in secular mindfulness by John Kabat-Zinn. Like.
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
I need to learn about trauma?
That's kind of like the question. It's like, why should you care? Why? Well, here's when I'm speaking to someone, I'll often talk about it like this. Any of the listeners here knows that asking someone to pay close and sustained attention to their inner world, that's a big ask. And for some people, that's a monumental moment. I know both you and I are in different martial arts practices or somatic psychology. That moment of saying, hey, what's happening inside can be profound for someone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's often what's happening, I think, in meditation, is if someone, if they haven't been doing a lot of somatic practice or embodiment practice, that might be the first time in a long time that they've actually paid purposeful attention to their body. And what I'm often saying to meditation teachers or any really body-based teachers is, hey, someone who's struggling with symptoms of trauma, this just asking them to pay attention, that can actually end up being dysregulating. And that's not a bad thing, but you might need to have some different tools in your toolkit to help someone navigate their inner world, because trauma often lives on in the body in terms of sensations. So it's not to scare, this is not at all to fearmonger for meditation teachers. It's actually to say, hey, it's really useful to know how to recognize trauma and how to respond effectively inside your practice. Even that's just having a couple referrals or having some basic modifications for practice.
Great. So most of the people listening to this show have heard episodes on trauma. They might have some sense that this experience of overwhelm that leads to hyperarousal or numbing, or the different kind of symptoms that are there. So we probably don't need to go too much into the very basics.
Yeah.
I think the interventions is a great thing to say there. So if someone's teaching meditation and they realize like, hey, this person has some kind of a trauma background, either they disclose that, or they start looking at symptoms and go, whoa, okay, this person's having a hard time sitting still. That was, for example, something I had as a trauma survivor. It was my first meditation retreat. I'm like, I can't sit in silence for this long. And it was difficult for everyone, but it looked particularly challenging for me and a few other people.
Yeah, for sure.
So it was bouncing off the walls. And later I realized like, oh, I regulate verbally, which I've since learned is super Irish, by the way. I taught in Northern Ireland, people would not shut up. And then I was like, oh, that's how they find safety. They talk. Right. So in a silent retreat, if you've got that Irish self-regulation pattern, you're fucked. You know?
Right.
So what are some of the things to spot, and then interventions or adjustments?
Yeah. So Mark, I have actually a question for you in that. When did you realize, was it during the retreat or was it after that you realized, whoa, I needed something different? Maybe it's verbal for you that enabled you to self-regulate. I'm so curious about how people actually realize, because so many people who are drawn to this work, they have all the different tools like, wow, okay, dance or this movement practice or this breath or this meditation practice helps me regulate. But what taught you that? Was it like you hit your head against the wall, or how'd it go?
I was just sort of clearly suffering with the non-talking thing more than people around me. And I thought, well, maybe they're all introverts and I'm just an extrovert. Maybe, you know, it's about 15 years ago, my first retreat. And then we had these little group meetings. It was a guy called Rob Babea, great teacher. And I just was like, blah, you know, after 3 or 4 days, whatever, it's my first chance to speak. And I went, oh, now I feel so much better. You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing was there was no touch. And I was used to regulate. I had a lot of touch in my life and I was used to that. And I just said, is it okay if I ask for a hug from someone I'm not sexually attracted to in these meetings that we're going to have every 3 days? And Rob was like, yeah, sure. You know, and a couple of guys hugged me and I was just like, oh, now I feel better. So by talking and through touch, I just felt a lot better. And I realized like, okay, I probably need where I'm at right now. I need those if I'm going to get through a silent retreat.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a couple of things that you're touching, a couple of things here. One is isolation and shame. This is one of the things I've stumbled across, you know, countless times where people will say, well, you know, I was in a retreat setting. It seemed like most people were doing great, or I had certain projections onto how others were doing. And I just felt like I couldn't either bring this to the teacher. I couldn't talk to them about it. And so there's unintentionally, I'd say, people that end up experiencing a lot of shame around their trauma. I mean, trauma often comes with a sense of shame. People feel a sense of that they're broken or that they're not able to regulate. And so, Mark, you're talking about, right, there are different tools, there are different options for different people. And so really a core part of trauma-sensitive mindfulness is to say mindfulness alone won't always be the operative practice for someone who's struggling with trauma. Like you might need talk therapy, you might need some more contact. And that's not wrong. That doesn't make mindfulness wrong. It's just a reminder that when it comes to trauma, people need different choices and options. And where people will get into trouble is if they're in an environment where it's like the only tool we have is coming back to the cushion. Sometimes we got to stick with it. Sometimes we got to be uncomfortable, but it's useful when it comes to trauma to have those different self-regulation tools. Is key.
Yeah, I mean, this was a pretty, Gaia House is the British equivalent of Spirit Rock. And it was pretty relaxed. There was, you know, rules and stuff, but they were pretty open-minded. So I was glad about that. And, you know, years later, I did like a hardcore Zen retreat. And I was thinking, God, I'm glad this wasn't my first retreat.
Sure. Yeah.
It was, you know, a lot longer. It was a lot stricter. There was a lot less room for kind of maneuver, different options, you know, but it was like, wow.
Yeah.
And I don't think I had a lot of shame, but I did have a sense of like, hey, maybe I'm a mindfulness dumbass, you know?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Like there was a little bit of that. Like, why can't I sit still? You know, and in that environment, it's very easy to think everybody else is doing fine when actually inwardly they're struggling as much as you are.
Right. Yeah, you're not hearing from others. Actually, I have a story. So my work is really, I'm working with the people who are guiding you. That's often, it could be yoga teachers, but it's often meditation teachers, people who are kind of holding the container. And I'm working with them on two different levels. One is that there's we can talk about this, but there's, you know, say 70 to 90 different modifications that one could learn to actually be trauma informed, meaning that you can recognize trauma, you can respond effectively, et cetera. But then on the other side, Mark, and this is where I think you and I probably have some overlap, is it's a lot about trauma sensitive or trauma informed practice. To me, is a lot about embodiment. It's a lot about what do we embody as a teacher or a mindfulness practitioner when we're encountering trauma. And a big principle inside of this work is around choice. So say, Mark, say we're working together, you come to me, you say you need a hug, or hey, I'm on this retreat, I could use some contact. The first place I'm going is I want to empower you to make that choice for yourself, but then I also want to take care of the container. So maybe we have rules, we have things like that. So that's what I'm balancing all the time. But if I got a quick story for you about this, I was at a sitting group maybe a couple months back, and there's a new person who's in the group. And at the end of the retreat or end of this meditation session, we did a little go around, and the person said, I hated that. That was fucking terrible. I wanted to run screaming from the room. And the teacher, I watched, everyone got kind of quiet. And I watched the teacher take a breath, relax, and said, that's great. Thanks for letting us know. Do you know how far away you'd want to run? And everyone in the room was like, whoa, what's going to happen here? And the person said, yeah, there's a hill outside of this. It was in a residential area. I said, I'd run up to the top of that hill. And the teacher goes, well, do you want to do that? Actually, can I, if you want to do that right now, you can. Maybe just bring a buddy with you. And anyway, everyone just kind of went, whoa. And so the person left, came back about 10 minutes later, and I'll never forget it, Mark. They had this look on their face of relaxation. They were kind of flushed, but in a good way. They weren't as pale. And they said, thanks for trusting that I knew what I needed. And that actually gave me the chance to let my body do what it wanted to do. And that to me, we could talk about whether that's trauma or not, but that was an embodiment to me on the teacher's behalf of actually trusting someone's knowing about what they needed, and it supported their embodiment. And when it comes to trauma, just because you're thinking about it differently doesn't mean the body will respond differently. So that's kind of an example of trauma-sensitive practice.
It's nice. Give me a few more examples of things that would be useful for the meditation teachers listening this to be aware of.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that the breath, in terms of the research that I've been doing, often through a lot of qualitative interviews, the breath isn't always neutral for someone who's struggling with trauma. Now, that might be obvious for a lot of listeners, but for people that haven't heard of trauma, I mean, the breath is often the central touch point or anchor inside of a meditation practice. For someone who's new, you're given the instruction, hey, attend to the breath, whether that's the breath at the nostrils or maybe the abdomen. And then when your mind wanders, which it eventually will, into thought, just come on back. Just bring your attention lightly back to this anchor point. But someone struggling with trauma, the breath isn't always going to be an easy place to cultivate concentration, right? So, our respiratory system, it's totally woven to our sympathetic nervous system, which, is I'm sure you've talked about on different podcasts, is connected to trauma. So that's what I want teachers to know, or really anyone who's doing body-based work.
Mm-hmm.
If you're asking someone to pay close and sustained attention to the breath, that could be really activating for them. Again, that's not a bad thing. Maybe being activated is great. It's exactly what they need. But just know, hey, maybe it's easier to pay attention to the feet. Maybe it's easier to pay attention to sound. And having some different options around anchors, for example, is one of the ways that you can be practicing trauma-sensitive mindfulness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always an assumption in embodied work as well as meditation that the body's this kind of safe, happy place.
Right.
And
right.
The whole point about trauma, isn't it? Tell me if I'm wrong, is that it stops being a safe, happy place, right? Or at least at times that sense of basic safety is gone. So, like, bringing people back to that may not be so pleasant.
Right. This is where the relationship between trauma and embodiment is just so important, because embodiment can often be talked about as a refuge, like, just take refuge in the body. And you might have someone who's in a group who goes, hell no. Are you kidding? This isn't a refuge. I've been trying to get away from my body for the last 10 years for good reason. So just the more we complexify this idea of how the body responds to stress and traumatic stress more specifically, then the more powerful we get to be when we're asking people to pay attention. It's a big deal to ask someone to pay attention.